Howdy folks. Today we're going to be talking about MVC. MVC stands for Model View Controller. It is a design pattern for how to structure code. Usually it's in the backend, but it can be done in the client as well. Let's get into it. So, to start off, this is how your application is usually set up. You have your database here. It talks to your application code. This is the part that you write, and that talks to the client. The application generally is just kind of a go-between between your client and database. So if we look at this, it's a little more complicated. This shows you the model, the view, and the controller. So let's talk about each of these pieces. The model talks to the database. That is its only job. It goes to the database, it fetches data, it sets data, updates, creates, all that stuff. That is what the model does. It interacts with your ORM in order to make those changes. The controller is what we would call your business logic. The controller contains most of the code that actually makes up your application. It's not always kept under the same folder structure because the controller is most of your code. There you'll get services and libraries and things like that, but generally controllers are the meat of everything. The view then is what is actually being displayed to the client. Now, if you actually have or using handlebars or something similar, or even server-side rendering, that might be what goes in your view. Personally, I consider APIs to belong as part of the view. Not everyone agrees with that, so your mileage may vary, but I feel that way because the view is generally everything that people use to interact with your application, and APIs count in that, I think. So you'll notice the model talks to the controller, the view talks to the controller, they don't talk to each other. That's because the controller has that logic that goes in between them. So let's take a look at an example. We have here a simple project. We've got our server.js. I haven't actually set up anything here, but normally this would be your Express server. And then we have 3 folders: controller, model, and routes. Notice I don't actually have a view folder in here. That's because this particular server doesn't have any real front-end stuff. So in that case, then the routes kind of acts as the view. But you might notice what that means is that not every server is going to have all 3 of those properties. It's not all going to have the MVC. Some of them may only have the view and the controller. Some of them may only have the model in the controller if you've got APIs and you don't have a regular view. Most of them are going to have the controller though. So let's take a look at our routes to start off. We've got our user routes, and here we've got a post and a put, so create user and update user. You might notice these routes are actually really short. They're pretty much responsible for getting the appropriate data off the body, calling another function with that data, and then returning the result of that function. And then they do a little bit of error handling. That's because the idea of MVC as a pattern is meant to provide a lot of separation of concerns. So the route shouldn't have to care about anything else. The whole point of the route is getting parameters out and responding. That's all it does. And having things broken up this way means that you can have very simple code. You can imagine, I'm sure, having multiple queries in here and a bunch of other stuff that could make this route 30, 40 lines of code. But instead, the actual body of it is just 3 lines. Fetching the body, creating the user, sending the status. This is the idea behind the view portion, with routes taking the kind of that placeholder. All this is doing is getting data and calling the controller. Note, it doesn't care what that controller does. It just knows that controller takes this data and returns some data. This also makes this code much easier to read because I can look at this and I can say, oh, what does this route do? Well, it's creating a user. That means it's probably the create user route. Similarly down here, this is the update user route. I know that. I could guess that based on the put right in here, but this really narrows it down. The more you can break up your code, the easier it is to understand what it's doing. Let's take a look at the controller now. So the controller has a bunch of stuff from the model. We have our create user, okay. So first of all, we're calling get user by username. Okay, we kind of guess what that's going to do, right? It's either going to find a user with that username or probably return null. Then we have an error, little validation check there. That's because when we're creating a user, we don't want to create a user that already has that username. Then we validate our username here, and we insert the user. Same with update user. We get the user by username, but here we kind of want the opposite. We actually want to throw an error if the user wasn't found, because if there wasn't a user found, we can't update anything. Then we call update. I call this update user model specifically because otherwise these would clash with each other, but you get the idea. That's maybe not the best name. Maybe this would be change user or something like that. Similar to how this is create versus insert. And that's really it. This is the controller part. Again, very simple functions. It's very clear to understand what they do. You can see, get the user, validate the username, insert the user. I don't have to care how these functions work. Just like how the route didn't have to care what create user was doing, it just knew that at some point the user got created. The user controller doesn't care what get user by username does. Is that hitting a Postgres server? Is it a MongoDB server? Is it something else entirely? We don't know. It doesn't matter. That's the separation of concerns. This is just concerned about creating that user with the building blocks we already have. The other thing that's useful about separating things like this, if I actually pulled the raw, well, not raw queries, but if I pulled my ORM functions in here, I'd have to duplicate that code here. But because I have that in the function, I can reuse those building blocks wherever I want. Same with update user model. I may need to do that as part of a CLI script or something. I can just call this function and it takes care of everything for me. So if we look at the model now, the model is the nitty-gritty of the database. You can see we have our get here, we have our creation here, and we have our update here. But again, these are very simple functions because these are the individual building blocks of the program. They're not doing much. This is just getting the user by the username. That's not by itself a very complicated thing. It is still 5 lines of code. Same with insert user. It's not that complicated. But the important part of this is because nothing else, everything touching the user goes through this file. If I need to change my ORM, or maybe I need to do something different with the username password, maybe I need to hash my password here, things like that, that's really easy to do. I can do that just by changing this function, and everything else should be using this function. So that is the MVC paradigm, design pattern. And the two main reasons we want to do this is, one, you know where everything is. You know that if something's touching the database, it's going to be in a model file. If it's business logic, it's going to be in a controller. And if it has to do with the actual interface between the client, then it's probably going to be in your routes or your view directory. That means that if someone else onboards onto your project, it's actually really easy for them to very quickly see what's going on and understand what's happening and find your code. The second is that separation of concerns. So you can see here, we start off with our route. We have the post, which we know is a create, but it's very simple. It just calls that controller method. And actually, should not be calling this from the user model. This should be coming from also the controller method. Then we go to the controller method. That is calling just a bunch of model methods. And so this whole logic from start to finish is broken down into little chunks that by themselves are easier to understand. That's important because when you're reading a function, you have to cognitively load everything it's doing into your brain and then process that, kind of similar to how Node does it actually. And the shorter that code is, the easier it's going to be for you to process it. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you all next time.